Eyes kept turning toward the back of the diner and the two people that sat there. Most onlookers saw the handsome if blandly dressed man first. Something about him seemed to draw the eye. Usually after a glance over his suit, brown today, and attitude, most people would take him to be a visiting businessman just out seeing the sights in between whatever meetings he was in town for. He had short brown hair and sat in a casually guarded way that spoke of someone not used to truly relaxing. It was impossible to see much of his eyes behind the expensive-looking sunglasses he wore, and his hands were covered by a pair of thin black gloves that weren't out of place with winter just barely fading into spring. His companion received far less attention than he did, despite her more unusual appearance. Long silver hair was mostly pinned back to flow down behind her shoulders to the middle of her back. Only a pair of braids were allowed forward, dangling from their position ahead of her ears, to swing lightly in a slight breeze. Had her head been further back, the braids would have rested on her chest, but she was currently leaned forward and sipping an amber-colored liquid out of an ice cube-filled clear plastic glass. The bark brown necktie she wore loosely likewise hung forward and folded on the table in front of her. The woman's outfit and hairstyle were somewhat dated in a clearly deliberate fashion and looked like something a certain trouble magnet reporter might have worn in a Max Fleischer cartoon. The necktie might have been loose, but the collar it was around was buttoned tight up to her neck. The shirt was a light tan that accented the darker green of the sport coat over it nicely. Her feet couldn't be seen because the long green skirt drifted below them, though the shape of her legs could easily be seen where the fabric of her skirt draped against it. There were 4 chairs. The man was sitting in one of them, while the other 3 sat empty and pushed in under the small table. The woman wasn't sitting so much as hovering next to the man, close enough that they pretty much shared one side of the table. With the way her skirt hung down below her, most people looking simply assumed a chair or stool was concealed under the cloth, and only a few took a second look to convince themselves of that, or something else more probable than that she was floating in the air. Her form was much smaller than his, and was obscured from the rest of the diner by how they were sitting. A sheet of grid paper sat between them, little hash marks drawn along the grid lines covered parts of the paper. In some cases, all 4 sides of one of the little squares were traced over, and inside those completed squares was written either a sloppy L or a neat S. There were currently a few more squares marked with an S than with an L, and the woman was staring at the sheet with some frustration as she sipped her drink. "A game that doesn't involve drawing on flat paper would be better," she muttered as she stared at what for her was currently a solid, featureless sheet of color that she couldn't describe to people without her eyes. The sound of a breaking dish drew up the man's eyes for a moment as a young woman with black hair and dressed in a waitress uniform found herself being harangued by a skinny, clean-shaven man in a cook's apron, and she tried to brush shards of ceramic off of her hands and apologize. The silver-haired woman felt the man look over at her again. She didn't have to look at him to know that he was watching the frustration on her face. Even if she couldn't literally feel the attention where it was directed, his eyes never really wandered over her body. Instead, there was always just a sort of concern behind his looks that she never tired of. Sometimes there was a frustration there as well, which was usually her fault. And then there were times like this. Times when there was a trace of exasperated amusement behind his look. "Raymond," she said sharply. "Eldon, why do you insist on playing this?" She glanced up toward one of the tables where a pair of kids were sitting with their parents and forced out the next word. "Stupid game, especially with a dyslexic, because you don't need anything to play it but something to draw lines on," he said. The man didn't bother to point out that dyslexia didn't match the trouble she displayed, and she was thankful for not exposing her little lie. "Just take your time, Lucretia. By the way, it's been a while since you wore one of those outfits. It's good to see you again." "I felt it was time to get back to it," Lucretia responded, then her attention focused as the color that was only hers started to fade away. The temperature in the room was stabilizing and the writing was becoming something legible for her. She looked for a place on the paper where she could draw her line to complete a square and claim it. Not seeing that, she looked for a place that she could put a line without giving Eldon a chance to do the same. There were a few obvious traps, with some trails that were waiting for someone to snap them closed. Then someone opened the door and let the air from the outside into the restaurant. The temperature shifted and washed out Lucretia's vision. with their own set of colors, drawing a frustrated grumble from her as she reached down to draw a hash through what she hoped was a safe place. The slight shake to Eldon's head told her that she wasn't so lucky. Lucretia winced as he drew another line, and then another, and another. Each new square completed giving him the chance to draw another line. This time it looked as if she'd given him 7 squares with her impatience. Lucretia didn't notice the waitress coming her way because the waitress hadn't yet noticed her. It was something of a hole in her awareness. The black-haired girl was focused instead on the list in one of her hands as she walked between the tables, a coffee pot in her other hand. The silver-haired woman leaned back in the air as if she were actually sitting on one of the chairs and muttered under her breath in a mixture of languages just as the waitress paused and the pot in her hand started to dip over, letting some of the hot liquid within slip out. Eldon saw it happening as he looked up to tell Lou that it was her turn and moved swiftly to grab and pull her aside, much to Lucretia's surprise. The stream of coffee missed her head and only managed to drip over her hand, which was bad enough. She didn't cry out, but gritted her teeth as the skin on her hand blistered and softened like it was being melted off. "It's Imola Mons!" she snapped in a hushed undertone as she swung her feet underneath her in a pantomime of standing up from a non-existent seat. "Oh!" the waitress gasped. As she spoke, her voice carried a distinct Norwegian accent. "I'm sorry. Here, let me fix that." At which point the girl took a breath and released a spray of icy particles over Lucretia's hand. At first, the relief and sensation of healing that came with cold air soothed this silver-haired woman significantly, but then she felt her skin hardening from the inside out. But that became secondary when she looked down to see the cuff and portion of her sleeve frozen solid a moment before it separated from the rest of her jacket and dropped to the floor, shattering. Keh! Lucretia's speech was more or less unintelligible for several seconds of heavily accented growling, while Eldon stood up and put himself between her and the waitress. "Oh, that was a little too cold," the waitress said apologetically. "Maybe I could—" "I think we'll be fine," Eldon said, cutting her off. "Scaldy!" the cook shouted. "Leave them alone and get to work." "Right," the girl said. "Sorry, I'll get right to it. Sorry about the hand again." With that, the black-haired girl nodded and hurriedly stepped back toward the counter, knocking aside a napkin dispenser and resetting it as she moved. The cook turned back toward Eldon and Lucretia then and glanced toward where the Peak was fuming angrily behind Eldon. "Sorry about that. She's new and I'm learning somewhat accident-prone." "Accident-prone?" Lucretia snapped, holding out her arm in the damaged sleeve past Eldon's form. "Did you see what she did?" Eldon glanced down. He only got a glance before she pulled the hand back. Despite that, he still saw that her hand was red from some receding blisters that most would assume were developing. It looked like what would be expected from a normal person just scalded. However, there was a strange stiffness to her hand and the way that she had moved her arm. Lou turned a forbidding but sheepish look toward him and then turned back toward the cook. "I'm sorry about the hand. We'll—" "Forget the hand! It heals," Lucretia snapped. "What about the—" She glanced over toward the children watching her tirade. "Flippin' jacket!" "If you'll let me," he paused as he took a further look at Lucretia and his eyes first narrowed and then widened. "Finish?" His voice was catching and he developed a slight stutter. His body language was starting to turn guarded. Besides that, temperature had dropped slightly and there was a recognizable pattern to the way electricity moved through his body. More than all that, she felt the recognition waking up in his attention on her, fixing on first the long silver hair and then the braids in the face. The man had just recognized her from the coverage back when she was on trial 6 years ago. "It'll be fine," Eldon said, looking toward her. "We'll just go." "Don't worry about pain," the cook informed them quickly. "Oh, I'm not," Lucretia snapped, twirling on her heels, or at least seeming to, and moving quickly for the door. "She's not going to do anything, is she?" the cook asked Eldon quietly. "Isn't she some sort of bank robber?" "She was a drunk kid who made a mistake, that's all," the bland man soothed with a steady tone. Eldon twisted about himself, feet clacking on the tile as he left the diner, and looked about for where the silver-haired young woman had gone. He breathed a sigh of relief when he saw her not more than a block down the street, looking toward him with the damaged jacket folded over one arm. The early March snow fell down upon the sidewalk and streets, especially swirling about her in gentle eddies and currents. Relaxing visibly, Eldon strode forward, feet crushing the snow underneath him. There weren't any other footprints in the fresh snow, but then Lucretia didn't usually touch the ground. It didn't take long for him to reach where she held herself and noted that her expression was still angry and halfway between a feral snarl and a spoiled pout. He glanced toward the hand under her green jacket. "It's getting better," she assured him. "Not as fast as it should, according to the sergeant," her friend responded. "Yeah, I wasn't talking about the hand," Lucretia commented with a shrug before glancing back toward the diner. "Bacafil! What did she do? It's been forever since anything like that's happened." "One of your seizures?" Eldon asked quietly. The silver-haired woman reached out with the burned hand and flexed the fingers as the last traces of the injury faded away. It seemed to be moving normally again to Eldon's eyes, but the way she tested it clearly showed him that the stiffness he'd seen earlier wasn't his imagination. Almost 4.5 months ago, Lucretia had been seriously injured. Her body had healed within a couple of days. Her abilities, however, were taking longer.